Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Lord of the Rings Online Casual Stroll Through Lord of the Rings streams. My name is Matt Elliott. I go by Scenario on the message boards, and I am a senior world designer working on Lord of the Rings Online. I've been doing this work for many, many years, and I'm excited to continue our series of streams. This one in particular, I was a little bit on the fence about whether or not it made sense to do it. Just because we've been very kind of Gondor heavy over the last year or so with my streams between the launch of King's Gondor as well as Outer Gondor. But it felt like it was a good opportunity to kind of go back through spaces that are a little bit fresh in our minds thanks to King's Gondor and kind of look at the before and after. Think about what the landscape looked like when it was originally introduced and the changes that we made to it as part of King's Gondor. So with that in mind, for those of you that are new to this stream, this is a world design and level design focused stream. So I'm going to be taking your questions about building the landscapes and dungeons of Middle-earth in Lord of the Rings Online. I'm not going to be able to answer any questions regarding things like PvMP, crafting, endgame content, instances in particular, things like lag, or even really talking too much about the details of what was in our recently released 2024 roadmap. There may be some questions that I can answer about what's coming up over the coming several months and throughout the rest of the year. However, I would probably hold off on going, or I won't say probably, I will be holding off on going into too many specific details about what we're building, some of which is in very much active development right now. So with that in mind, I also do want to say I often forget to have a drink while I am talking. So if it's been a while since you've seen me take a break, have a drink of water, or have a drink of ginger ale, let me know so that I can make sure that my voice does not die on us as we go through this stream. So with that in mind, here we are at the entrance to the Paths of the Dead. So this area is accessed from Rohan. The epic storyline does take you up through here, and you get to see kind of one of the coolest entrances that we have, one of the coolest doorways we have to any door in Lord of the Rings. This is a very kind of ominous entrance. So here we are within the Paths of the Dead. Now this area, much like Moria and Gundabad, utilizes our dual height map technology, which is honestly like one of the best tools that we had gotten. We couldn't have done Moria without it, and it just really helps us build more natural feeling cave spaces. Excuse me. We can do these things in dungeon space using different assets to kind of create cave ceilings, which is what we had to do in the past. Looking at Thorin's Gate housing, for example, as well as there's a section of the Etten Moors that has a rock top to it. But when we have the opportunity to use something like dual height map, it makes for a much better feeling and looking experience. So this area was built during kind of my in-between times, but I love the atmosphere. So I did not have any hand in building this, but like I said, I love the atmosphere of this space. And honestly, I'm a little bit disappointed that it is very much just kind of a stopover region. There is not much that happens in the Paths of the Dead. You kind of are just making your way through in order to get to Gondor, which is a shame because this is just such a cool, like, creepy, scary kind of setting. It'd be really interesting to expand on it, and that's maybe something that we can consider in the future, filling in the gaps underneath the mountain. So Do92 asks, do you think you would ever return or get an expansion pack to the Paths of the Dead? I was hoping a new pack could be way bigger and more stories in them, and their culture, explore more of their underground cities and tunnels and instances, really just make it huge like Moria. So, like I was saying, a space like this is a great opportunity for more like filling in the gaps kind of thing. Though the kind of role that a space like this fills, while it certainly gives you more playable space, more playable landscape to explore, it doesn't necessarily kind of scratch that itch of like filling in the overland map, because really a space like this, we can put it anywhere. It doesn't have to have a specific analog entrance and exit, because these sorts of spaces can be as complex and deep as we want them to be, without needing to worry about what region they're going to bump up into and whatnot. It's the same kind of thought process that I have. As I'm currently working on the Catacombs of Umbar, which is our current working name for it, but is not the final name for the region. But working in that space, in the Update 40 landscape space, that's another one where it's like I wanted to build it so it kind of matches the footprint of the city, but because of our file restrictions, how big a land block is, it kind of makes a little bit more sense to grow it out a little bit more so that everything fits kind of evenly within the land blocks. These are really cool effects too. The ghost particles that we have going on here with the random spirits just kind of milling about doing their own thing. This is one of the few areas in here where you're actually, where there is actually something to fight. Overall, this whole area is pretty barren, pretty empty of much to interact with, which is where I think it's a bit of a missed opportunity. The instance that happens here, where you have a bit more control over, what the combat is like in this space, I think was really, really interesting. But I think there's a lot of potential in these areas that could be further expanded on if we ever decided we wanted to do something in these spaces. I actually have not been in this area. I have not been in this area very extensively. I think I explored it around on one of my characters on live, and then really just kind of pushed through to get to Gondor on subsequent characters. All right, let's take a look at what we have for some more questions in here. So Squirrel says, so will we get a cover of Diggy Diggy Corsair in the update? I don't know what that is, so I can't make any promises on that front. Leb Scotland says, I wish you could go into here from King's Gondor. I know it's a different time, but still there are areas like that, North Ithilien, South Ithilien. Yeah, so the with King's Gondor, with every region that we build, as Lev mentioned, it's a very set in a specific time kind of setting, and it would feel kind of a little weird to teleport basically back in time, entering through King's Gondor, but that just means that there might be a better opportunity in the future to have a present day, air quotes, present day version of the Paths of the Dead that can spin off of King's Gondor. Let's see. Eros216 says, can you make an area space as large as you want, or are there finite limits to what you can safely exceed? So we cannot build things as large as we want. There are size limits. Like if we decided we wanted to make a region that was all underground, we could build that region, but there's still kind of limitations to how big that region can be. It can only be so many land blocks wide, so many land blocks tall, that sort of thing. So, there are limits to how big we can build things. Running around in here just makes me like looking at all of the platforms that we're using to build this, and how, at least with my approach to building some of the more modern city spaces and using landscape instead of platforms, because that allows us to have a lot more flexibility in texturing. Because right now, like, in order to get, you look at the difference in detail here compared to when you're down on the terrain and you have the frills and you have just, kind of more complexity to the landscape. Where am I? That's where I am. That you can't get when you're building with normal platforms. So I think, like, one of the things that we really put a lot of effort into with King's Gondor was where we had these cities, kind of trying to, as much as we could, replace the platforms used to kind of build cities with terrain, with landscape, so that we could have a more realistic looking feel to those spaces. We could have more detail in those spaces without really adding more complexity to them. So LOTRO says, do you have a specific date that you can communicate for the release of the instances of Umbar? I don't have any specific dates that I can provide. That's also not really my place to make any statements on. My suggestion would be that you pay attention to the message boards and social media, and as we have, when we are ready to make any sort of bull roar or live announcement as far as those dates go, that's where that information will be. Lev Scotland says, do you guys do field trips together to get landscape building inspiration? You've mentioned watching videos before. So we don't do field trips, though there are times once in a while where someone's vacation might happen to be taking them to a location that kind of dovetails nicely with places that we're going to be building. So, for example, when we were starting to work on Umbar, particularly we were looking at kind of Moroccan and Mediterranean influences for some of the assets, and conveniently, Chris Pearson, one of our lore master and our world design lead, he and his family were going to southern Italy for a school trip. So while he was there, he was taking like tons and tons of photos just to have that as source material for us, so that we could see how they built different bits of landscape, how they did their landscaping, how they did their architecture and whatnot, how they built their gardens. We've never. I know there are, particularly if you look at like behind the scenes videos for larger games and larger studios. I think Ubisoft does this quite regularly, where they will do R&D trips to different areas of the world that are influenced by what they're doing. That's usually outside of our budget to do things like that. Green Tea asks, what technical upgrades or new technology that will improve world building are you looking forward to the most? So there are a couple of things that I've talked about internally with one of our engineers who has been a little bit of my partner in crime on just like ideation and coming up with different ways that we can approach building landscape. And one of the ones that I would really like to find us a way to do is the introduction of something called splat maps. So splat maps, for those of you that don't really know, they're kind of like big world-sized textures that can be used to kind of indicate, they're like a grayscale that can be used to indicate what kind of texture should be going in a certain way. And using tools like World Machine, we can generate splat maps that, can kind of know, oh, well, this terrain is this steep, so we'll assign that a color, and this terrain is this steep, so we'll assign another color. And what that would allow us to do is have these larger files that we could then use some sort of programmatic method to slice them up and turn them into an initial per land block height map, or not per land block height map, per land block terrain painting for a region that we're working on, because that's I think one of the things that I've been trying to do as we've continued working on LOTRO and trying to grow it is trying to find ways to accelerate our setup efforts and allow us to have more time to do kind of more fine detail work. Working with a tool called World Machine that has been really helpful for me to be able to kind of go into a new region, build out a height map very quickly, and kind of take what would have normally been a multi-week process for us, turn that into a several day process instead, where we can use World Machine to kind of help give us some what's the word I want, some really high quality height maps that we've constructed using it, and use those to build a region's height map. And that's allowed us to significantly expand the amount of landscape that we produce. So that's allowed us to take, for example, Carlon and Swanfleet, building out that height map from scratch would have been several months, or not several months, but probably 2 months worth of work, not including terrain painting, scene file, implementation, all of that. But using World Machine, we were able to kind of condense that down. World Machine paired with Photoshop allowed us to kind of speed along that process so that myself and the other designers that were working in those spaces could then dedicate time to much more fine detail and rich detail efforts. So we'll take a look at some more questions. Do ask, in the films they found secret passages from the rocks. Do you think if SSG ever came back here, we could have little pathways throughout Gondor and Rohan that let you into different parts inside the mountain? We can certainly contemplate that if that is something we were ever to build. I know, for example, with Catacombs of Unbar, I am doing what I can to build in a lot of interconnectivity between this new landscape and the city above it, as well as just try to better improve accessibility throughout the city as well. So I think we try to keep some of that in mind, if it makes sense to have that in place. So Epic Games TV says, can you build a fire pit housing item for Lindleby Homes? It's a wasted hook right now because Rohan stuff is too big. So one of the reasons why I adjusted the fire pit hooks to accept other items is just because of that fact, is like they are such big assets. Fire pits themselves for meat halls, they are such big assets that it just didn't make sense to have only those assets be used. And we knew Lindleby in particular was going to be tight. Erebor was a little tight with them as well. So allowing things other than fire pits to go in them was kind of meant to be a compromise to allow them to be usable so that they aren't just completely dead decorations, in lieu of having smaller fire pits that can fit in those places. Druid's Fire asks, scenario, why are there invisible walls preventing us from jumping off the top to quickly get back on our way? It's a bit frustrating for Morlad when rushing to the next quest. Morlad, and then Soft Snake follows up with, Morlad has lots of invisible walls. Can you please remove them? So I can't speak specifically to why those walls are there. I think there is, they're kind of an artifact of one particular designer who built them that kind of felt the need to have them there. I don't know what kind of stuck spots might occur if we were to remove them. And at that point, the cost and benefit of removing them versus not removing them comes into question, right? Like, if removing them, which is a somewhat simple task, then generates 30, 40, 100 stuck spot bugs for us, what is, is it worth the effort, right? Eros says, the skyboxes for the newer areas are much more realistic looking. Would you like to go back to the earlier zones and bring some of the older ones up to current standards? I wouldn't mind seeing older textures get a facelift. I do think it is interesting sometimes, especially when talking about skyboxes, because these skies here with the wispy clouds, I use these sky objects in Swanfleet and Cardalon, and there were a number of people that were kind of upset that assets that they had previously seen as, well, these are Gondor skies, were starting to be used elsewhere. So it was really kind of funny seeing, like, in my mind, I'm just like, these are objectively nicer looking clouds. I want to use them. But seeing how in other people's minds those specific assets were so very tied to a specific place in game, and the idea of them appearing somewhere else in game was a little distressing. We run into that before with other assets as well. There was when we introduced the Wildwood, there were some crofters buildings that, to me, from my perspective, I look at them as, oh, these are like just fairly generic stone farmers' buildings, so I'll be able to use them. And when it went to Boror, there was a considerable player response to, like, these are Gondor buildings. Why are these here when they shouldn't be here? And our compromise was to slap together a somewhat quick texture variation on those buildings so that they could be distinctly Bree, using kind of Bree colors. I think there are still some people that were like a little off-put that those buildings were in Breland, and so because they were in Breland, they shouldn't be anywhere else. And I think in an ideal world, can't pass up that. In an ideal world where we had unlimited budget and unlimited staffing to produce fresh assets every update, we probably would. Not to say that's a healthy way to approach a live service, but I think we'd probably do more new assets. But we're a smaller shop, and a lot of us have a live service design mentality, and a lot of that means that we tend to approach things from the perspective of, do we need new art for this, or can we get away with doing a simple texture variation on it? And I think more often than not, we kind of we want to first see if we have assets that can be used and adjusted slightly, as opposed to asking for whole new things. I know a lot of people were frustrated that, like, dwarves, for example, every new dwarf kingdom we went to, kind of had very similar shapes and silhouettes, even though the colors are different. And it's expensive to wholesale create whole new sets of structure assets that are unique from other stuff, particularly when you have assets that actually work really, really well for placement. You know, it's like you're reinventing the wheel, and then you have to experiment with a whole new set of shape languages. Whereas, you know, sometimes in terms of just being able to produce quickly, which we always need to do, it's easier to think about it in terms of like, you know, do we need a whole new set of stuff, or is just, you know, a color change here and a couple new assets there enough to really help us differentiate? So George DLNR asks, what res are you playing on? Also, what aspect ratio? I'm not sure, because this is whatever I have set for my normal play stuff. So we're, you know, I'm running in ultra high, very high, but I am running in an admin client, which is a little bit heavier in terms of perf. So if you're seeing like popping and hitching and glitching and whatnot, that's more often than not the whatchamacallit, the admin client doing its thing. Right now I'm running in windowed mode, so I think my current desktop is like 1920, something like that. Alright, so Softneck GR says, you also used Eastern Gondor's skybox to Angmar. I believe this choice was wrong because the skies in Eastern Gondor point out Mordor's direction, while in Angmar it's just out of place. I'm not sure what you mean by that, because Angmar is a generally overcast region. You know, and often in those skyboxes we had the north highlighted to kind of focus on Carn-Dûm. So I'm not sure what day files you're talking about, where you're seeing those things. If you're seeing them, it may be that there's an error somewhere, possibly, but we can now swim to the Drake Daly Island near Dol Amroth. Don't think it's technically possible to let us swim to the Kin Islands. No, you would not be able to do that. We tend to keep housing areas sequestered off. I'm not sure in Gondor, in this version of Gondor, if we made any changes to passability, but maybe there was something changed. If you're talking King's Gondor, that's a different story. And those changes may have just been made as part of general cleanup and access through things. Green Tea asks, do you think the original starter areas provide a decent experience for new players, or do they need a bit of refreshing? Are there any world building issues you'd like to fix? So I think the original starting areas do well enough, but not so well that we didn't feel the need to produce the alternative one through Before the Shadow, just to streamline things a bit more. I think there's a definite nostalgia quality to those original areas, even after like cleaning them up a little bit, like as we've done in the past with a couple of different updates here and there. Like when I first came back and started working with SSG. One of my big things was I went through and gave much of Breland a touch up, for example. But I think all of those older areas in the game definitely do still feel their age, even with touch ups here and there, particularly in how we approach world building. How we approach terrain. I think it's interesting looking at kind of how heavy-handed we were with things in the original game regions, like how heavy-handed we are with impassables, with terrain texture usage. Like there wasn't as much subtlety as we have now in our terrain work, and I think it could benefit that. But again, it's another one of those, like, if we were to say, for example, go through and revamp the terrain map, the terrain for Breland, would we be causing more problems than we would be solving, basically? Like, if we redid the terrain, then we'd also have to go kind of land block by land block to make sure that any of the work we didn't break quests, cause stuck spots, like all those sorts of things. So yeah, like I think we'd all love to go back and see old areas modernized, but often it's a tricky thing to do because of the other problems that it could cause if we were to do that. Like, we can't, for example, we can't really, once we've built a scene file for a region, particularly with things that have physical stuff in them, things like trees and rocks and whatnot that players bump into, we don't really ever want to go back and change it, because we don't necessarily have a good sense of where a quest designer might have on a whim decided to place something. And now that we've updated these scene files, all of a sudden the tree that he had tacked a note on has moved, or where there was a little campfire and a few NPCs sitting, there's now a boulder on top of it, or there's a giant yellow rock in the middle of the greenway. Like, those sorts of things happen. So Do92 asks, are we still getting elf housing, or since the new plan is more Umbar in 2024, will we be getting Umbar housing instead? So we still are very interested in elf housing, and there's one of our designers, not me, has expressed an interest in developing it, but housing is something that always kind of ends up being when we have available time to do it. So the introduction of a new neighborhood will really be dependent on this person's flexibility in their schedule. So we want to build one. It's something that we're excited to build when we have the time to build it, but it really is going to depend on how busy 2024 is for us. Certainly a new neighborhood is not something that we wanted to put onto the roadmap just because of that. Because we weren't sure if we were going to have the time for it, and it would be better to have it be a surprise if we were able to make our schedule work, as opposed to indicating that it was something that was coming and then not be able to deliver it. Let's see. Lost Shire Hobbit asks, what made you decide to put the Stone of Eric in the Blackroot Vale? I get that it's near Paths of the Dead, but that seems too obvious answer, but is it as simple as that? I believe it is simple as that. Like, it is, I'm sure there is a more specific, lore-intensive reasoning for it. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer for that. But the hill folk living in the White Mountains to the north there, the Stone of Eric is right on their front steps, right? Like, it is near their territory, it is visible from their territory, and it is a strong reminder to them as they look down the valleys from their homes that, oh, we made a promise, and they're not letting us forget that promise, kind of thing. So, sort of related from Squirrel, how come we can swim from Bel Newell to Jack's Finale, but if you swim vice versa, you die? So you should be able to traverse from Bel Newell to Jack's Finale both ways. It may be that as you are swimming, you are finding yourselves off course and not, you're finding yourself going off course slightly and running into Deathwater as you are exploring. But a straight shot should get you there without defeat, both ways. Epic Games TV asks, can you build or suggest to a team member for fire pit houses? So we're back on that. Something that I have very specifically requested, so not related to fire pits, but very specifically requested from our art team, because sometimes what they'll do is they find themselves with a little bit of free time. So sometimes what they'll do is they will come up with packs of housing items, ideas that they have kicking around their head. So I very specifically requested to the artists that, if they find themselves doing that at some point in the future, that they keep in mind that they build things that are kind of more room filling. We know hooks are at a premium, and while kind of smaller individual deco items may look really nice, they don't help fill a space very efficiently. The stories of people using 20 hooks to do a table setting, that sort of thing. So I've requested that, as we think about housing items that are specifically being made for housing, that we think about having things have a little bit larger footprint for use inside. So going down through, Soft Snake GR says, pink trees are missing in King's Gondor. They aren't missing. They are intentionally not present. So the time setting for original Gondor is kind of more springtime. That's why we have all of these flowering, blossoming trees in these regions, because that's usually when these kinds of trees blossom, is in the springtime. When you go into King's Gondor, the setting and time for that has progressed. And King's Gondor is set past midsummer. So you're not likely to have as many flowering trees as you are to have flowering bushes, shrubs, field wildflowers, that sort of thing. So that is why the flowering trees of King's Gondor have been replaced with just normal foliage. Lev Scotland says, what future region or type of region would I be excited to design? So I'm really kind of enjoying the challenge of the catacombs of Umbar, and doing what we can to come up with a way to make distinct and interesting spaces in there, but also like building it out a little bit smaller than we've built some of our other landscapes. It makes it allows it to be a little bit more of an intimate region and a little bit more detailed. Most dual height map spaces generally require a little bit more detail anyways. And I think the other things that I'm excited about doing, we've got stuff coming up for update 42, which will be a lot of fun, and I'm hoping to get some new scenery assets, some new rocks and whatnot to play with to kind of really help distinctify that. And then I think, long term, I know people are wary of the concept of lower level regions. But I'm really I'm looking forward to having the opportunity to building kind of the long kind of requested and somewhat needed alternative zones to areas where we don't have a lot of good coverage for level breaks. We've got a bunch of them, particularly kind of in the mid-game range. And so should we have the opportunity to do some more of that stuff, I'm excited about doing that. This isn't to say that we would make the focus of those spaces take up an entire year's worth of updates, or that when we do introduce these spaces that they would be purely just for those lower level breaks. I think kind of taking the model that we took with Before the Shadow and applying that to future fill in the gap regions is a good plan. So that in addition to a lower level landscape region, there are also things in those areas that are compelling to endgame players as well, whether that's delvings and missions or like instances that happen that can scale into those spaces. Like I think those are important to include in anything that we do like that in the future. All right. Let's see. Going down. Let me find a good vantage point, and then I'll go down through a few more questions. We've got 20 minutes left, so I don't know if I'll be able to make it all the way to Pelargir at this point, but we'll see if we can get to Linhir at least. And maybe we can use the next stream to cover Eastern Gondor, and then that'll take us into Ithilien, which will be fresh for this stream series, since we haven't done King's Ithilien. So normal Ithilien will be where we go. It's interesting, you can look out, this. If you look out over here, you can see, what is Anfalas, but is not an Anfalas in the King's Gondor version. The terrain here is a little bit different. I tried to keep it somewhat similar so that the profile was the same, but we do have like completely different ruins in the distance there. And maybe someday we'll be able to go back and change that up. But I don't think we'll ever retroactively implement Anfalas into these regions. But we have a lovely view of Dol Amroth from here, so I'll pause here and take a drink and then go down through some more questions real quick. All right. So Eros216 asks, with the upcoming kin work, will that require you to redo parts of neighborhoods? It shouldn't. There's been some talk about the potential of things like kinship neighborhoods, maybe not necessarily to coincide with this kinship work, but as an opportunity to provide more value to kinships in the future. It's something that Orion and I have been chatting about a little bit here and there. Whether that means, what exactly a kinship neighborhood is, we don't have clearly defined, but we do have kind of the concept of a housing feature that is dedicated to kinships. So Do92 says, if we ever get the South Farthing for the Shire, will the South Farthing have a forest where we can see Wistmead that we have in the Halloween Festival? TBD. I don't know a good answer to that question. Maybe, maybe not. Excuse me. Sometimes those things are okay to just have exist as a space somewhere in the Shire. It really depends on the level of effort that would be required to introduce that into the landscape and how easily it would fit. Druid's Fire says, Elf Premium housing for me is something I'm both super excited to see when it gets here, but also worried that I won't like the color or styles or whatever. Yeah, I think elves are probably the most intricate of all of our building designs. Hobbits have a very quaint design to them. Human housing is fairly simple. Same with dwarf housing. It's fairly simple and blocky, whereas I think elf housing is something where the shape forms of the buildings themselves are very different and distinct from most other housing, both housing neighborhoods we have and just general architectural sets that we have. And that's both cool and a little challenging to work with. Green Tea asks, is there any plan to drastically increase the amount of hooks in future houses? No. We are already kind of butting up against what I'd say is the upper limit of the number of hooks that can be supported in a house right now. I've pushed it as far as I can, and part of the reason why I've done all of the different hook consolidations is to provide people with more flexibility in decorating, knowing that a substantial increase in the number of hooks is likely not something that is going to be feasible. You know, if 64-bit servers come around and that drastically changes load times on everything and drastically improves load times in housing neighborhoods, maybe that's something that we can think about again. But in the meantime, really adding more hooks is really not something that I think is the way for us to go. Building neighborhoods a little bit more smartly, a bit more compactly. I think we went really big with Rohan houses, or particularly with meat halls. I tried to pare that back a little bit with Erebor, and Erebor was still, particularly because of the high ceilings, was kind of considered a little bit too big. Shire house or Lindleby housing, we tried to make the interiors a little bit smaller, so that either make the interiors a little bit smaller and or make the flexibility in just closing off rooms a little bit more attainable, to kind of help that. Each neighborhood is kind of a stepping stone for us. We take learnings from all the previous ones and try to implement them in there. And while some new features can be integrated more easily than others, not all of those learnings are easily backported, if that makes sense. Lev Scotland asks, thanks for the replies. Is Catacombs of Umbar a normal region or more solo or open instance? It is a normal landscape region. We've talked a little bit about having some components of it that are geared a little bit more towards small fellowship play in very specific controlled locations. And we know sometimes there is nostalgia for difficult landscape camps and whatnot, but the reality is that when players run up against it, they're often kind of expecting to solo it, so when they get face stomped by a group encounter on landscape, it becomes it becomes a sour point in that landscape experience. We had that happen when we did the Gladdenmere mini region, extending off of the Vales of Anduin, where we the southern half of it solo play, but the northern half of it was all group play. And when players just kind of rolled into it, they were expecting to roll all over it. And when they instead got rolled, it was not really the experience that they were wanting out of it. So whatever happened to the changing mob camps and daily quests from Wildhood? They never seen them return. So as far as the changing camps, so we brought them back for a little bit in Gundabad. So these changing camps, they do take a little bit extra setup time, and I think they work really well in areas that are meant to be kind of this grindy experience. So something like in the Wildwood is great because we can kind of make these quests, the Wildwood space is really kind of meant to be an an alternative to your kind of Angmar experience. If you don't want to go to Angmar, you can kind of go to Wildwood. You can do your dailies and missions and whatnot there, and kind of grind through those levels. And having the switch state camps there works really, really great for those, because that kind of keeps the grindiness feeling a little bit fresh when you visit. Each time you visit, it could be one of a different set of things. We brought those back in Stonejaws, the Pits of Stonejaws, a little bit as well, though we had to set them up a little bit differently because they were larger camps. I think any future fill-in-the-gap region that we do, we'll want to bring more of those switch state camps in, just to kind of diversify and help keep those areas feeling fresher in subsequent visits over time. Lost Shire Hobbit says, Dol Amroth, love that city a lot. Always a big moment reaching there. That's usually when I get the level 100 craziness. Yeah, I think Dol Amroth is really kind of an anchor point for a lot of the Gondor experience, and I feel like it really marks the point where players go from this sort of peaceful, not yet quite yet at war Gondor, to really now it's time. Now we have to head to the east. Now we have to participate in the war. So it's really kind of that anchor that gets you ready to jump right into the war. So Eros216 says, since you've done post-war Gondor, how would you feel about a post-war Rohan? Like with any region, if there was a purpose for us to go to Rohan post-war, it might make sense for us to do that. I know that there are several characters from the books that are currently kind of in limbo in Midsummer Minas Tirith, because they're waiting for the right point in time in their stories to hit for them to be able to start their path back to Rohan. And if we ever felt that we wanted to tell those stories, that's when a post-war Rohan would likely happen. TD Growl says, is it possible to make the hooks universal for any decoration? So I think most hooks now are very, very flexible. And with the exception of there's still kind of a distinction between wall and non-wall furnishings, in large part because wall hooks rotate differently. And just in having conversation with other designers, it really kind of makes sense to keep them as their own thing. But for interior hooks, for a normal furniture hook, for example, you can use anything basically now up to yard items. We're likely never going to make humongous hooks something that is consolidated, because those often have special features attached to them that wouldn't be all that performant if they were to be able to be hooked on everything, for example. So, I think there might be still some room for us to consolidate here and there, but by and large, I think there's a considerable amount of flexibility in what is available for hooks now. The introduction of universal hooks was largely done in starting in Erebor, because I just needed a few extra hooks, and at the time we hadn't consolidated yard and furniture hooks yet, and I just needed a way to allow for yard and non-yard stuff to coexist in a couple of spots. So that's where it started, and now universal hooks are kind of a catch-all when I've used up all the other hooks that I can use in the space. Lev Scotland says, I'm very happy that the Catacombs is a normal region. Any hint about it? Yes. It's set underground. Let's see. Green Tea asks, which area have you created gave you the most satisfaction? Which parts of your work do you find the most satisfying? So I still feel like I really knocked it out of the park with Swanfleet and Carlon. I think I'm hard pressed to produce something better than those two regions. I think everything just kind of, from a world building perspective anyways, just kind of clicked together, between our new technologies. Let me get it a little bit brighter here. Between our new technologies and really having the opportunity to approach the region and the regions surrounding it like they were actual real landscapes, and figuring out ways to connect all the different rivers and mountain ranges, and how do existing regions butt up against this, and just I also really enjoyed making it like one of our most open sets of regions that we've ever done. Fewest impassables. The impassables that exist really are obviously make sense for them to be there. They're just really satisfying places to have stewardship over for me, because it was an opportunity to build a space like it was a real space. So let's see. Dead Marshes also came in the point update of Path of Dead, if I'm not mistaken. I believe so. We'll get to that. That might be its own stream. I'm really wanting to get through Gondor so that we can get to places that we haven't been yet. But I think I think it's pretty valuable to just like look at where we've been, look at what King's Gondor has done to change things up here. I think running around here in now that we've crossed into the Dawnless Day portions of Gondor, it's one of those. It brings to mind the challenges of gloom fatigue. The things that we always kind of run into is with gloomy places, with places like Mordor and Angmar and Moria and Gundabad, where it's just like how gloomy is too gloomy, how dark is too dark, how long do we want to keep players in these areas, and will the players bounce off of these spaces if they're forced to be in them for too long. So let's see. Lost Shire Hobbit says, can I just say thank you for the ambient environment hooks on the Lindleby houses so I can have Enidwaith skyboxes, and I love it. I also brought the Rohan ones as well so I can switch them up. I think the skyboxes are definitely, with every new housing feature that we introduce, are going to be kind of our standard offering. When we add those things, it's always a going forward feature. It's a little bit harder to implement some of those things backwards into older neighborhoods, just because in order to really make those features, in order to make things like ambient music, ambient environment, the fences, to really make those work, the spaces have to be built with them in mind. And a lot of the older neighborhoods weren't originally built with those in mind. So a lot of and not to say that the layouts for them are bad, but a lot of them aren't kind of square enough to easily support those things without some negotiation. adding them into Belfalus housing, for example, adding ambient environment and ambient music, like those, adding those in was a real pain because none of, with the exception of like the kinship properties, none of them are really square enough to support the square volumes of these dayfile and music changes, which is why going back and adding them into the original housing neighborhoods is such a challenge too, because those neighborhoods are even more clustered together and awkwardly shaped. Do92 asks, in the new expansion pack, will we be going more into the desert regions or still tropical area? I think that is a question that is best pondered on for the time being. As we get further in development and closer to kind of marketing milestones, you'll have a better sense of what things look like. All right, I am almost to Linhere, and when I get to Linhere, we'll wrap up the stream, and I'll see about closing off any other questions. So you all have until I get to Linhere to ask any more questions. Softnake says, is it possible to make us choose which Gondor before or after war we want to port to every time we cross the landscape portals? It is not without doing it in a way that is kind of like that doesn't, there's not an easy way to do it that feels non-gamey, if that makes sense. There is a feature that many years ago we produced as part of a R&D effort for not LOTRO, that I had called the waypoint destination array, where it's like when you collide with a door, instead of just it taking you to the location that is, it says to take you on there, it instead pops up a list, kind of like the housing entrances that pops up a list of all the different neighborhoods you can go to. Like this instead would pop up a list of other destinations that you could go to, and then you could select from there, as opposed to, right now our solution, this is what I had to do for Belfalus housing, for example. If you're in the Belfalus housing neighborhood, you'll see that there is a horse, there's a stable that previously had a horse that would take you to Dol Amroth. And that was fine until we introduced King's Gondor. So I had to introduce a different horse, a second horse, that would take you to King's Gondor Dol Amroth instead. And that always that feels a little weird to me. Where I feel like from a UI perspective, from a user experience perspective, it should really just be, there's one thing you click on, and then it pops up a list, and you get to click from there. And if I were to ever get that feature, if that was something we ever felt was like a good investment in our time, then I think the uses for that would really help towards some of the things that you're talking about in, letting players decide which version of a space they want to go to. It would be similar for going to Elderslade. Do you want to go to Elderslade or Elderslade at War? Do you want to go to Mordor, Mordor Besieged, like those sorts of things. So, so one last question. We'll answer Squirrel's question. Can we get Mission Stable Master horses at further adventures before the Shadow and Umbar? So I think there were decisions made when it came to things like the further adventures of Bilbo and Elladan and Elro here to kind of keep them separate from Mission Stable Masters. Whether or not that decision should still stand, up for debate. With the Before the Shadow missions, generally since we considered them already fairly accessible as part of any newbie stable, you basically can get there from a newbie stable network, and then use the stable routes across those two regions to get to those. especially since they're spread out over multiple locations. We didn't really feel like they should be added there because that would add noise. And then Umbar is something that we're talking about now. One of my goals for Update 40, once Catacombs of Umbar is done, is to take a look at overland traversal and see where the pain points are, where we can make changes, where we can add accessibility and whatnot. So, anyways, thank you everyone for attending this stream. It was great to kind of go back through the original Gondor as we were originally introduced to it, and kind of seeing where it came from versus where King's Gondor is now. We're going to wrap up this stream now, and next time we come back, we'll continue on through the remainder of Gondor. So thank you, everyone. If you haven't yet, and you're interested about what's coming up for us in the year 2024, take a look at our message boards where we have our roadmap discussion going on. You can see the graphic image of kind of what we're planning for each quarter there. And yeah. That's about it for right now. Stay tuned too for any announcements about the upcoming Umbar instance clusters as well. Those will be announced on the message boards and through social media. Anyways, hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thank you for coming and asking your questions. I was happy to answer most of them. There were a few that I wasn't able to, but have a great afternoon. Have a great week. And for those of you that are in the Northern Hemisphere, stay warm. Have a great night, everyone.